Hey, sophomores, we got a second vocab video for this chapter. I'm sure you're all thrilled about that. So let's look at our first word, and that is Venice. All right, so Venice is a city in modern-day Italy. It is a city that is full of canals, and what you really need to know about Venice is that it becomes basically the main trading center in Europe during this time period. There's a lot of trade that goes on in the Mediterranean Sea, and Venice will be the city that makes a lot of trade partnerships with emperors like the Byzantine Empire, but also with many of the Muslim cities during this time that are much more advanced and brings a lot of goods into Europe. A lot of this commerce will help start things like the Renaissance, which will later happen in Europe. Battle of Tours, it's back. All right, the Battle of Tours is where the Christian forces of Europe and the Carolingian Empire were able to defeat the Muslim Empire here, coming from Spain, from the Umayyads. They were able to defeat them, and basically what this meant is that Europe, most of Europe, was able to stay Christian, and Muslim advances stopped. Had the Muslim forces won the Battle of Tours, we might see a totally different world today. It is very possible that if that had happened, that the Muslim Empire would have gone further and further into Europe and really changed a lot of the world that we have today. I mean, I'm speaking English right now, which is a European language, right up here. French is a big country, very powerful country today. That would all be quite a bit different if this battle had been lost. So it's the Battle of Tours in 732. The Estates General was basically a representative body in France, where people had some power and the ability to vote in their government. It wasn't completely democratic, though. I mean, you had three estates in the Estates General. You had the nobility, who was basically the church. They were one part, and they had one vote. Then you had the nobility, or the people with titles who were, closer up in the aristocracy. They had a vote as well. So you had the church figures, the clergy, and you also had the nobility, who were two of the estates, and they had 2/3 the power. And the third estate was everybody else. So again, one estate was the clergy, the church figures. Second estate was the nobility, or the aristocracy, the people with land and titles and wealth. And the third estate was everybody else, who was well over 90% of the population of France. Lay investiture. Lay investiture was the king or the emperor basically saying that he would have power to appoint church figures. So it basically would give the ability of the king to appoint church figures and tried to take it away from the Pope in Western Europe. Obviously, the church didn't like this because this took some of their power away and gave some power to more power to the emperor or the king. So the church was against this. And again, layperson is someone who is not clergy. So they're like, they're a member of the church, but they're not like, like a priest or a bishop or someone like that with a title. And that's lay investiture. The Magna Carta, which was signed in 1215, was something that gave more power to people. What it did was, it basically made the king give up some of his power to Parliament. Parliament in England is kind of like our Congress or our body of representatives of people who can vote or advise the king in this case. So what it does is it basically takes power away from the monarchy and gives some power back to the people. Now in Parliament, it wasn't the regular common people who got the power. There was more of nobility, more of aristocracy that had power. But it did take some of the power away from an absolute monarch, away from the king, and gave it to some of the people to form a parliament which would advise the king and eventually would get more and more power until today, where the parliament pretty much has all the power that exists in England. And today, the Queen of England is pretty much just a symbol. She doesn't even have power. So the Magna Carta starts this. It basically gives more power to the people in Parliament and takes power away from the absolute monarch or the king. Oh, and I say king at this time because in England it could be a king or a queen, but at this time there were basically kings who were in power. Manors are very large houses, estates that have a huge amount of land. Think kind of like a mansion, manor, mansion. So there would be obviously lots of servants or people who would work for the people who own the house. Someone who has a lot of power, normally someone in the aristocracy or in the upper class, nobles, would have a manor that they would live in. The Hanseatic League was a league in Northern Europe. Here we have England, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, I think I got those right, Scandinavian countries, Germany, where they would trade goods back and forth. And this was important because in Europe there was less trade during the post-classical era, but the Hanseatic League was an example of an area where there was lots of trade and goods going back and forth. So many of the people who live in these port cities where ships were going back and forth would be able to gain more wealth, trade more goods, and advance the economy of Europe at this time. Oh no, that's Norway, and that's Sweden right there. Jeez, I should know that. A guild is basically a beginning of what's called organized labor. So basically in a guild, it would mean people who are professional at something, like let's say a blacksmith, someone who would, make horseshoes and other iron objects. They would form what would be called a guild together, where they would organize themselves in workers to try to get themselves better pay for their skills. Also, what would happen in a guild, many guilds work with this, where it's a skill, so you got to learn it. So many times in guilds, they would start off with you'd be an apprentice or someone who's just kind of learning the job. You don't get paid quite as much, but you're learning from a master. So you're an apprentice. You're learning from a master person how to, work with iron, for example, or make shoes or do some kind of skill trade. And then later on, you would become what's called a journeyman. And a journeyman is kind of like, yeah, you're a pro. You know what you're doing. You're a pro. You're pretty good at it. You're in the middle of your career. And finally, at the end, you become a master. A master is someone who is like an expert at it and can also teach and take on some apprentices and teach them how to do the skill. And these are called guilds, which became more common in the later post-classical era in Europe and actually meant for more skilled labor, and people could be more like in the middle, not just like, near the aristocracy or poor peasant farmers. Guilds also increase as cities grow in Europe and there becomes more specialization of labor. Vassals, you basically want to be thinking as the nobility or the aristocracy. Here we see feudalism in Europe. We have the king on top. Then our nobles who own most of the land, have their large manors. Vassals means like you're working for the king, the next person up. Then we have the knights, who basically they work for the nobility, and they are basically like their army. And we see the peasants or serfs who are on the bottom. So your vassals are in this area right here pretty much, meaning their nobility and that they work and serve the king. Let's get to our next one, which are the knights. The knights were pretty much your armed soldiers, and they were private armies who worked for the nobility right here. Okay? The nobility who owned land. Your knights were their army. They were supposed to live by a code of chivalry. They were supposed to protect the peasants who lived and worked for the nobles, although many cases in history show that the knights were actually kind of mean and basically kind of like bullied or subjugated the nobles subjugated the peasants instead of like helping them. So they were basically, knights are the armies, the independent armies that nobles would have on their land. So this whole system here is called feudalism. It existed in Europe in the post-classical era, and actually Japan too. Just kind of replace knights for samurais, and you kind of see a Japanese system here. A little too simplistic, but let's continue. So feudalism is basically a system where you have the king, and he has the nobles own different plots of land, and they have to pay their taxes to the king who's in charge, and the nobles have private armies who are knights. Now, in feudalism, these nobles actually have quite a bit of power. And yes, it's more of a decentralized government. So feudalism is more of a decentralized government where much of the power is given to nobles who serve the king, and they have their private army of knights. And these, our next word, serfs, are the poor people who are on the bottom of society, who farm, and actually in many cases cannot even leave their land. They have to live on the land of the nobles. They're not quite slaves, but they're pretty close to it. And they serve and live on the land of the nobles. And actually, even to leave the land, have to ask these nobles for permission. So this is the system of feudalism, and we see our nobles, our knights, and our serfs. All right, the bourgeoisie. Think of the word bougie for a second and what that means. Someone who's bougie is trying to act like kind of like all uppity and everything, even though they're not. It's actually a good way to think about bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie were a new middle class that formed in Europe. So we just saw feudalism. The bourgeoisie were these new people who brought in new money, who weren't nobles, weren't aristocracy, didn't have a title. But what were they able to do? They were able to work in business, and they were able to make money on their own. So in this time period of the post-classical era, these are people like merchants from Venice, merchants from other areas like in the Hanseatic League, who were able to make a lot of money, didn't have a title, who were able to make it through trade and business, and started to get money and were able to start rivaling the nobles and aristocracy. So bourgeoisie are a new group who has money, who make it through business, and are able to rise up. Lay people are basically people who are in the church but do not have a title. They're your regular common people who go to church, who are members of the church. They're not a nun, not a bishop, not a priest, not a minister. They are regular people who go to the church who do not have a title or a position in that church. I myself, for example, am a lay person at my church. I go there, I volunteer, I help out a little bit, but I don't have a title. Okay? And, wow, we're done. Those are our words. It took a while.